Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bud. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and drop a like on this video. I am trying to hit 100k subscribers on this channel and we are 10k away, so your subscription would be much appreciated. Also drop a like, only takes 1 second and makes a massive difference in how the video performs in the YouTube algorithm. Today's video is going to be me going over my X factors, and this is going to be part 1 of 2 for the Western Conference. For those of you who might not be aware of what an X factor is, and I guess it isn't entirely something that is strictly defined, to me, an X factor is generally a player that could go either way, whether that be because they're inconsistent or because the team is kind of banking on them taking a leap in order for them to be successful. Is a player that can go either way, like I said. So with that being said, I do think it's worth mentioning that X Factor is also kind of relevant to what the team is trying to do. In terms of, like, if you're a lower seeded team like the Houston Rockets, you're not expected to have some X Factor to turn you into a contender, but an X Factor towards maybe you being a little bit better than you would expect, or really showing promise for the future, something like that. That can still be applicable for the season and X Factor in the season going well. It's just they have different expectations depending on if they're winning or losing. So with that said, let's start off with the Phoenix Suns. This is going in order of the NBA standings last year. So the Phoenix Suns X Factor, I'd gotta say it's probably DeAndre Ayton. And DeAndre Ayton's consistency is not necessarily his own fault, but rather the role that the Phoenix Suns give him. I personally think the Suns, the best way to go about their future at this point would be to just simply remove the importance of Chris Paul from the equation, especially in the regular season. Like, I'm not saying like just not use him, but I'm just simply saying, like, Chris Paul should be the third best player on this team, or at the very least the third most utilized. And that's very much not the case. He's very often the #1 most utilized guy. And in certain moments, and especially in the clutch, that's all well and good. But I think the way that the Suns end up winning a championship is with Chris Paul third in the pecking order, and it's Devin Booker and DeAndre Ayton ahead of him. So, how the Phoenix Suns go, I think, is going to be dependent on how much they choose to involve DeAndre, especially after his contract situation. That's going to be a little interesting because there's definitely, some bad feelings in that locker room, or at least with the front office. And I'm curious to see if that will affect the on-court play at all. For the Memphis Grizzlies, I easily have to go Dillon Brooks, although, to be fair, he's not, I would say, like, this is a player that is inconsistent. Dillon Brooks is pretty consistently inefficient and pretty consistently takes bad shots. But if you can get a version of him that maybe calms the fuck down a little bit, that would make a world of difference, because Dillon Brooks is like, 4 field goal attempts per game less away from being like an S-tier role player. But he just has to take those stupid shots every game. For the Golden State Warriors, that X Factor is easily, to me, and I maybe should have made him the thumbnail because it's like probably more controversial, but to me, it's easily the case. Klay Thompson. Klay was not very good for them in the playoffs last year. I understand the Warriors won the championship, but Klay was very inconsistent, taking a lot of bad shots, and there were games where he was the reason they won, but there were also games where they were the reason there were also games where he was the reason they lost. So if you get the consistent pre-injury Klay Thompson back, especially on the defensive end, because he was also not nearly as good defensively as he had been before injury, that'd be great. All that stuff's fine, by the way. Like, he's recovering from 2 years worth of severe injuries. I don't expect him to be the same. But the player that we saw last, if he was more similar to the players we saw before, the Warriors would probably be like my guaranteed title favorite if that were the case. But I don't trust Klay to be that again, or at least this soon. The 4 seed was the Dallas Mavericks. I forgot that. I don't understand how Luka was not in more MVP conversations last year if he averaged what he did and they were the 4 seed. But whatever, that's a whole separate point. I guess it has to be Christian Wood, right? every other player on the team is fairly consistent. Christian Wood is a guy that you don't necessarily know how good he's going to be. I personally think very favorably of Christian Wood and think that the best case scenario for Christian is what you're going to get out of Christian personally, just because I think this situation is perfect for him to be that best version of himself. But it's also not something that I can say with my chest. It's not something I can say confidently is going to happen. Like, I'll bet a little bit of money on him having an all-star appearance next year, but I'm not betting the house on it, if you get what I mean. So it's definitely going to be Christian Wood. For the Utah Jazz is an example of a team that is not trying to win right now. The X Factor, I guess. I mean, it would be just kind of all of their young talent, but I guess right now, because they don't have much young talent, after they trade Donovan Mitchell, they'll probably get like Tyler Hero or something. But presuming that, at least as the roster stands right now, really the only young talent that I'm thinking of is Talen Horton-Tucker. So I guess their X factor is Talen Horton-Tucker and seeing if he could potentially be a star level player. Like, that's something that could go either way if he's actually worth a damn. And if he is, then you made a home run of a trade, and that's one positive thing to look at going into this rebuild. For the Denver Nuggets, the easy and obvious answer there is Michael Porter Jr. He's been relatively inconsistent throughout his career, and when he opened his season last year before he got hurt, he was really, really bad. So has to be him for sure, especially considering just how consistent just about every other role player or player on that team, period, is. An X Factor doesn't necessarily have to be a role player, especially because Michael Porter Jr. could be an all-star level guy next year. But like Aaron Gordon and KCP, fairly consistent guys, unless Aaron Gordon decides to take like 2 or 3 too many dumb mid-range shots, but that's about it. For the Minnesota Timberwolves, the X Factor is probably D'Angelo. No, the X Factor is probably Anthony Edwards, because like if Ant is as good as he was last year, then the T-Wolves will be a good playoff team. If Ant takes the leap that I think he is going to take next year, which is like him getting to like 28 points per game type territory, if that happens, I think they're a contender. Just a matter of whether or not he is going to leap from like where he was last year to like fringe all-star, or from where he was last year to bordering on superstar type conversations, which I think I'm not confident Anthony Edwards is going to make a big leap next year. The Los Angeles Clippers, you got to go John Wall for them. I think that's obvious, especially by comparison to the other options available. He could really go either way. If you get him at like 80% of what he was, then holy shit, the Clippers are terrifying. If you get him as he was on the Rockets, which was the most empty and inefficient 20-7 you'll ever see, then not really much worthy of note there. For the New Orleans Pelicans, that one is interesting because I don't know. I guess Herb Jones, but like Herb Jones is consistent. I guess it's Herb Jones just because like, can he be so good defensively that it makes up for how not good defensively the rest of the roster is, save for Jose Alvarado and Larry Nance Jr. Like, is Herb Jones going to be a really, really good defender, or is he going to be a generational single-man defense? That can be a difference maker. Not necessarily single-man defense as in him alone makes them a #1 or like top 3 defense like a prime Dwight Howard or Rudy Gobert, but just like at the very least he's good enough defensively that if he gets starters minutes, they'll be the 18th best defense, So I guess that's my pick for them because there's not really a strictly inconsistent player, unless you want to say like Devontae Graham, but I feel like Devontae Graham is pretty solidly not a huge part of the rotation anymore going forward, so I don't even know if that's necessarily an option. For the San Antonio Spurs, again, not a team that's expected to be particularly good. I guess, once again, it's going to have to come down to a young player, and like, if their season's great, it's going to be after one of them takes a leap. I guess it's got to be either Josh Primo or Devin Vassell. I don't know shit about Josh Primo, but Devin Vassell gives me a lot of Chris Middleton vibes, and I could see a world where, being that Vassell averaged like 15 last year, I could see him averaging 18, 19, maybe even 20, just because someone has to take some shots now that DeJounte Murray's not there. Although some would go Keldon Johnson. I personally think Keldon's going to be just as good, if not worse, next year because I think DeJounte Murray's playmaking played a bigger role in his success than people are giving him credit for. Than people are giving DeJounte credit for. Sacramento Kings. I'm going to go Kevin Huerter on this one because Kevin Huerter is a player that I've been a big fan of, and I could see a world where him getting that, if he gets that, presuming he does get that starting spot, which I think he would by default, and then maybe he could lose it to Malik Monk, but presuming he gets that starting spot, I think it's well within the realm of possibility that he averages like 17 points a game, basically just living off of basically getting open from the Sabonis Fox pick and roll. Like, I do think there's a world where Sabonis and Fox plus shooters, and Harrison Barnes would be one of them. I don't know who the third one would be. But that lineup could result in like a lot of open shots for shooters. And I think Kevin Huerter could have a season where he shoots like 40% on like 8 attempts and he gets to like 17 point per game territory. So that is my selection for the Kings. For the Portland Trailblazers, the X Factor is... What is the X Factor for the Blazers? I guess maybe Shadion Sharp. If he's really good, maybe you can trade him for a star player at the deadline. Or maybe he's just really good, but also he's a guard, and it's like, how many good guards do you really have room for in the rotation? I don't know. If it's not him, it's probably Jeremy Grant, and whether or not he's going to be Nuggets or Pistons Jeremy Grant. For the Oklahoma City Thunder, I want to say the X Factor would be Chet Holmgren, but he might not be playing. I guess Josh Giddey, and if we see some development from him as an offensive player, because I do worry that long-term his ceiling is not particularly high. That, like, he has a decent floor, but I don't know how high his ceiling is really going to be, because as great of a playmaker is, specifically as a passer, there's almost nothing else that he does that even better than below average at an NBA level. So that is concerning. I think his defense is fine, but it's also partially just because he's a 6'8" point guard. But like, yeah, he's not a strong finisher, not a strong ball handler, not a good shooter from three or from mid-range. And his playmaking is like good passing, but not creating that many opportunities for people. He'll make a risky pass, which is noteworthy and what separates playmakers on different tiers. But the fact that he doesn't have gravity going to the rim and can't really provide that much rim pressure, and really just fear of him scoring the ball, period, don't know how much value he's really going to bring. So if he could show signs of being more of a scoring threat, that would make a world of difference for them going forward. And for the Houston Rockets, if Kevin Porter Jr. could really prove to actually be a point guard, I think that would make a huge difference. But I don't know. I really think he's going to be good enough to be a secondary playmaker, not a primary one. But if he could be that primary playmaker, then cool. So that was my X Factor for every team in the Western Conference. Be sure to stick around for part 2 of this video, which will come out, I actually think, tomorrow, because I'll drop the hot takes video after this one later today. So yeah, that is it. Goodbye.